Hello to everyone watching at WashingtonTimes.com and on C-SPAN's American History TV. We welcome you to the Washington Times for this special episode of History as It Happens podcast. It's for people who want to think about current events historically, and it's available wherever you get your podcasts or at historyasithappens.com. I'm Martin Di Caro, and today we're joined by James Grossman of the American Historical Association. We welcome you, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me.
We're excited to have you here for an important discussion about divisive concepts, the past, how it's studied, whose version of events gains ascendancy, has always been a battlefield in our country. That's because origin stories matter as much now as ever before in America. James, the AHA is trying to influence this debate, now roiling the nation over what should be taught in history and social studies classes. First, what are divisive concepts and where did this controversy come from?
Well, divisive concepts seem to be things that some people are objecting to, that teachers are teaching in their classrooms as part of American history. It seems to be that teaching the history of division is problematic for some people, and that's where this term divisive concepts are. That if you teach students that America was deeply divided over slavery, over Jim Crow, over various things over the course of our history, then what some people are arguing is these are divisive concepts that divide our country, rather than these being the history of our country that we have to understand if we're going to deal with divisions.
So, in other words, students need to learn about these divisive concepts, in your view.
Students need to learn the history of divisions, of conflict, of differences of perspective, differences of experience in American history. This is not divisive concepts. These are facts. And the facts are that these kinds of divisions have been part of our history. And if we don't understand them, we can't deal with them.
I've been reading about the 1790s recently. That was not a period of unity politically in our country. So we've all seen scenes from school board meetings across the country on news broadcasts with parents objecting to the teaching of what they call critical race theory or anti-racism curricula. Even here in the Washington suburbs in Loudoun County, been making national news. Some school board members feel threatened and intimidated. Where did this controversy come from?
Well, it seems to have come from a small group of people who, in essence, sat down and said, how do we distract Americans from what the real issues are in American politics and get them to argue about cultural issues, about issues that, quite frankly, aren't really issues. If you look at the legislation that's been introduced in 27 states that relates to this, most of that legislation prohibits things that aren't happening. And so a lot of this is people screaming and yelling about things that actually either aren't happening or are happening only here and there in very few places. Nobody's being indoctrinated. Children aren't being indoctrinated. And quite frankly, people who are so sure that their teenagers are being indoctrinated don't realize that it's very hard to indoctrinate a teenager.
Now, I have a copy of one bill here, but before I read some of the language, you mentioned to me when we were preparing for our conversation today on History as It Happens, live and in person, by the way. It's nice to see you in person.
Good to see you in person.
Instead of over Zoom,
right?
For a change. Yeah, you mentioned to me that the legislation is basically the same in every place. It was written by a conservative think tanks, the Heritage Foundation.
It comes out of think tanks. It comes from one particular journalist who has published basically guidelines on how to write this legislation. It comes from conservative activists who has actually very proudly announced that he has branded critical race theory. He has basically created something that was barely a presence in American education, certainly outside of higher education. And he's proud of the fact that he has branded it and made people think it's what he says it is, which is, quite frankly, brilliant marketing and very bad history.
So here's a bill in the state of Ohio. I believe this is now law. Here's the language. No public institution of higher education, school district, or public school, including a public charter school, shall direct or otherwise compel students to personally affirm, adopt, or adhere to any of the following tenets. Here's one of the tenets.
Let's stop there before we get to the tenets, because let's do this piece by piece. You've been a student. I've been a teacher. I don't know if you've ever taught.
No, I don't know if I was a very good student either.
Well, but I'm guessing that as a student, you weren't compelled to do anything.
I did go to Catholic school.
And even in Catholic school, which was a little stricter than the public schools, there wasn't a lot of compelling. I mean, you were compelled to take gym class. You were compelled to sit in your seat.
But not in history class.
Well, in history class, one never knows. But this notion that these schools are compelling students to believe X, Y, or Z, I would love to see some examples of this compelling going on. In history classes, there's not a lot of compelling going on.
Yeah, well, here's one of the tenets that are now off limits. For instance, teachers are not allowed to teach their students that any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior. I mean, that sounds harmless enough in print. That individuals by virtue of sex.
Let's stop there, because I want to parse this piece by piece. So read that again.
Sure. So no public institution of higher education, school district, public school shall direct or otherwise compel students to believe any sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin is inherently superior.
Let's stop there. There's a phenomenon in the marketing world called push polling, right? Where by asking people particular questions, you subtly imply facts. It's almost like the, when did you stop beating your wife kind of push poll issue.
I understand what you mean.
And that's what's going on here, because when you see this in the legislation, then that implies that there are teachers out there, history teachers out there, who are teaching students that one race is superior to another. That actually has happened in American history. That took place in history classrooms for over a century, where students were taught that white people were superior to everybody else. And quite frankly, none of these people objected during those 100 years. There are not history teachers out there teaching that one race is superior to another. They might be teaching that there have been historical patterns where white Americans have had advantages. That's fact. Where white Americans have used the civil and civic power that they have to oppress other people. That's a fact. Right. Nobody is saying, I don't think, history teachers, as far as I know, are not saying to students either white people are superior to black people superior to white people. That's not what's going on in history classrooms. And that, quite frankly, is not what these people are objecting to. But by articulating that in the law that way, they're implying to people that this must be happening, because that's why you have to make it illegal.
And the way this manifests itself in a classroom, I assume, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that teachers might second guess their decision to teach about Jim Crow, teach about how the Nazis looked at Jim Crow as a model, how the Nazis saw American Indian reservations as something that they wanted to do in the east of Europe.
They might. I think that probably that,
to just cite a couple examples.
That kind of chilling effect, which is what you're describing, probably comes from somewhere else in the legislation. We can keep reading the legislation. I think that comes from someplace else in the legislation. This part of the legislation is just nonsense, quite frankly. There are other places in the legislation where you get more into this issue of divisive concepts,
Okay.
where they're teaching about divisions, where teachers might say, I better be a little careful here.
Okay, we'll go over one more tenet and we'll move on to what the AHA, American Historical Association, is doing about this. Individuals by virtue of sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin are inherently responsible for actions committed in the past by other members of the same sex, race, ethnicity, religion, color, or national origin. So teachers are not allowed to teach that idea.
So this is where we get more fuzzy and a little more interesting in some ways. It is impossible to deny that, especially in certain parts of the country, but more or less in different degrees everywhere, pretty much in the United States, but certainly more in some parts of the country than others, that white Americans did things that oppressed African Americans. That's a fact.
Yeah.
That's a fact. We have documentation of lynching. We have documentation of legally mandated segregation. It wasn't Black people who passed laws that forced Black children to go to school in southern states that were funded at less than 1/10 of the rate per student than white people. So these are historical facts. This kind of discrimination that was in essence racially structured. Now, a teacher has to teach that in order to teach American history. That doesn't mean that the teacher is looking at the white kids in the class and saying, this is your fault, or this is your parents' fault. Now, a white kid in the class whose great-grandfather was in the state legislature in Alabama in the early 20th century and voted for the appropriations for these schools, you can't deny that this kid's great-grandfather was partly responsible for this. But you're not saying to the kid, you're responsible. So again, this is a bit of a red herring here. Okay. It is saying that over time, white Americans have been responsible for this kind of discrimination, for this kind of violence. It's not saying that every white kid in the class has a great-grandfather who was responsible for this, because my great-grandfather was in Europe until the late 1890s.
Well, I always assume that, although again, I haven't been in a classroom for quite a while, that students in the United States have been taught about slavery, Jim Crow, et cetera. And we're going to get into what students are actually learning and how well Americans are educated on these subjects in a little bit. I have some polls here. But first, the AHA is taking some action about this. Here's a joint statement that your organization and you personally signed with other educational organizations on legislative efforts to restrict education about racism in American history, stating firm opposition to a spate of legislative proposals in at least 20 states. You've also formed something called the Learn from History Coalition.
We haven't formed it. We've joined it. I don't want to take credit for the work that somebody else has done.
Well, thank you for correcting me. Learn from History Coalition seeks to combat deliberate misinformation about the current state of history education. So you've joined the coalition. Why don't you briefly tell us what these efforts are about here?
Well, I can start quickly with the coalition. The coalition I think at last count had at least 25 members, most of which are education oriented. Just a few of us are there as historians. I think a lot of the expertise in the coalition relates to what happens in American classrooms. It includes the National Association of School Boards, and includes a superintendent's organization. And we're part of it, I think, and as is the National Council for the Social Studies, the Organization of American Historians, and the American Association for State and Local History. The four of us are there to help them with the historical part of this, the content. But what we're trying to do is to help teachers think about how you can teach what you already described in a way that is professional and honest. So as you were saying, We've always taught about slavery. We've always taught about Jim Crow. This legislation, when you read it carefully, says that teachers in some of these states, teachers must teach that slavery, Jim Crow, lynching were deviations from the broader arc of American freedom. And the deviations, especially from the visions and the values embodied in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, etc. Now, it is very possible for a good teacher, and I hope many teachers do this, to have students read the Declaration, read the Constitution, and talk about, was slavery a deviation from these principles? Because some students would say, no, actually, slavery is built into these. Other students would say no. Some historians say yes. Some historians say no. These are things we argue about. These are things people do in history classes. The problem is
arguing when the ink was still drying on those documents.
Yeah, arguing about what they mean, what they said, what the intentions were of the people who wrote them. The problem is that phrase, anything but, anything other than. In other words, what people writing this legislation don't want teachers to do is to say that slavery, continuities of racism, segregation, various other things that have happened in our history, they don't want kids to believe that these things are completely consistent with our founding documents, that in fact, it's not that, and this is not saying the founders were evil people. The founders were slaveholders. That's a fact. That's a historical fact. And to say that therefore they created founding documents that were influenced by the values that they had, by the economy they lived in, by the social structure they lived in, that makes all the sense in the world. So where the problem lies is the notion that teachers should not be able to have students talk seriously about what the role is of racism as it relates to founding documents, continuities of American history. That's what we object to, is teachers being told, you can't talk about that because those are divisive concepts.
Interesting. Race, just one issue. For instance, the treatment of labor unions through history. I've done a bunch of podcasts lately about the military-industrial complex and how we got to this point where we don't question this prosaic military presence across the globe. Any number of concepts might make students not feel uncomfortable, but maybe question the beliefs and the ideas that greeted them at birth, as I say, in the lining of our crib. Columbus, for instance.
It'll make them uncomfortable. Look,
Columbus. I just did a podcast about Columbus. Most of what we learned about Columbus, at least what I learned when I was a kid, was garbage. And then I started to learn that he committed some cruelties. He was locked up, put in chains, brought back to Europe. He was such a terrible administrator. You don't learn those things as a child. And then when you learn these things as an adult or a teenager, it might jar your worldview. And I guess that's what some of the opponents are saying. They don't want their children to learn that American history is not all glories.
That's what learning is about. Look, yes, these are things that will make you uncomfortable. If I'm a 15-year-old student and I am from a military family, 3-4 generations, and I am exposed to a conversation in class about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, I'm probably going to be uncomfortable. And I might even say, this is un-American, this is terrible. And then the teacher's going to say to me, excuse me, this is from a speech by Dwight Eisenhower.
Yes, that's right.
It's part of our history. General Eisenhower warned us about this when he was President Eisenhower. There isn't much about history that is not going to make somebody uncomfortable.
That's the point, right?
And that's how we teach students to step back, ask new questions. Yes, Columbus, I learned in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, which certainly helped me learn some names and dates. This is, over time, historians ask new questions because the world around us changes, and there were things we didn't think were important 50 years ago. Now we do. But we also see new documents that we didn't know about 50 years ago.
I mentioned Columbus as just one recent subject I've taken up on my podcast, but he's been in the news. His statues have been in the news. When you were on the podcast a few weeks ago for an episode titled Charlottesville Says Goodbye to the Confederacy, we talked about Confederate statues and their origins and the assumptions people today might have had about why those statues were put up versus the real reasons. We'll get into that. One more point about the battle over school curricula. A recent headline, just to show how crazy this issue can get, out of Texas, where a school official, her name was Gina Petty, the executive director of curriculum and instruction at a school district in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, 8,400 students, telling a teacher, apparently, I think I'm getting her name correct, that if you're going to have a book about the Holocaust, make sure you have a book that has an opposing view, because if you only teach one side, the new law in Texas might come down on you, so I suppose that translates to, if you're going to teach about the history of lynchings, you have to come up with the other side on that too. I mean, this is crazy, of course.
Well, first of all, she has apologized.
Yeah,
she has apologized. But in a way, there's a way in which the apology is not irrelevant, but is still a problem. And that is that we have to ask, what is it that induced her, stimulated her to say this to the teacher? And it was the legislation that we're objecting to. Because of that legislation, she scratched her head and said, I need to tell this teacher that there needs to be an opposing viewpoint, because that's what the legislation says.
Just a point of fact that Gina Petty was the official who was caught on a tape or recording. The superintendent was Lane Ledbetter. It was that person who issued the apology, saying, yeah, we know there's not two sides to the Holocaust. Just so I'm right about that.
The superintendent issued an apology on behalf of the school district. The important thing here, though, is, and this goes back to some wording that we had earlier, is this notion of opposing viewpoints. That when we teach history, if we're teaching it well, just like if we're studying it well, we teach what I would call different angles of vision. There can be many angles of vision on the Holocaust, because you want to be thinking about, how did it happen? What was the response of the German people? Were the German people in support of what was going on, the non-Jewish German people? There are lots of questions you can ask about the Holocaust that provide different angles of vision, and that's what students should be learning. But this notion of opposing viewpoints, what that assumes is that what teachers are doing are saying to students, this was good and this was bad, and we're going to have an opposing viewpoint. Nazis were terrible, or Nazis weren't so terrible. That's not how we think about
exactly
history.
Yes.
And so that is the problem.
Simple dichotomies.
Simple dichotomies. But yes, these laws are going to stimulate these kinds of actions. Because what it's saying to administrators is, if you want to be doing your job right, you need to force teachers to do this, or else the parents will be coming after you and the school board will be coming after you. And so you have a chilling effect on the teachers. You have administrators who aren't quite sure what their role is, as in this case. And you have parents and school boards looking over the shoulders of professional teachers who are trying to teach students history in the way that they have learned how to teach history as professionals.
So let's talk about the larger context in which this controversy is occurring. Our nation's been having a reckoning with its history of racial injustice. Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd, and and other Black people killed by police. And into this maelstrom in 2019 came the New York Times 1619 Project. So we've been talking a little bit about fables on the right in our country. For instance, this so-called 1776 Project, which is also, in my view, poor history. But on the left, if we could use a simple dichotomy, the 1619 Project came in. And by the same token, that, in my view, should not be taught in schools either, because it's festooned with serious errors about the American Revolution. And this speaks to my initial point when I opened up our conversation about the past being a battleground, a battlefield. We have these polar, these extremes of competing narratives, and neither one is really altogether correct. I know that AHA has had things to say about 1619 Project. What's your view on that?
I think the first problem is the notion of competing narratives. That's a simplistic way of thinking about what historians do, what historians teach, and how we argue about it. There are different, I'm going to go back to angles of vision. There are different ways of seeing the 18th century, the 17th century, the American Revolution, the role of the founders in perpetuating slavery. And it's the problem is that we have people who are saying it's either this or it's this, as opposed to saying, okay, first, is the evidence, what is the evidence that's used in either this set of materials or that set of materials? Where the evidence isn't very good, you have to say, this evidence isn't very good. And you could use it even as a learning experience. You throw it in front of students and you say, okay, let's read this. And you say to the students, tell me what evidence this historian, or in this case, a group of journalists, has mobilized to demonstrate their argument. What is the actual evidence? I'm old-fashioned, use a blackboard. You go up to the blackboard, you say, this is the evidence that they've marshaled. Okay? Now, where does that evidence come from?
You're talking about 1619.
You could do that with 1619. You can do that with that 1776 report. One of the differences is that 1619, however debatable it is, and yes, professional historians have been arguing over various interpretive aspects of it, especially this notion of what a founding is. There were professionals involved, professional historians. Not as many as I might have liked, but there were professional historians involved. This counter argument, 1776 report, there was not a single professional historian of the United States on that commission. There was one historian, he studies ancient military history largely. Basically, they did this totally bereft of any expertise whatsoever. So these are not equivalent. The materials in the 1619 project, in some ways, need to be looked at the same way other materials that are out there to be used by teachers. And what happens is you put things out there, they get reviewed, they get discussed. People say, yeah, this doesn't work.
Because a lot of existing textbooks aren't all that great.
I mean, look, if you took economics in college, you probably had a textbook written by a guy named Samuelson, which is by now probably in its 50-something edition. Economists change their minds more than historians do, maybe, I'm not sure. But yes, the scholarship and knowledge evolve. And it evolves by people throwing out controversy. According
to this Medill News Service piece, the 1619 projects being considered as part of the curriculum in 4,500 schools nationwide. You mentioned some of the professional historians who are on the left, by the way, who criticized the 1619 projects. First of all, I have read it. I think some people who criticize it haven't read it. Some of the essays are quite good. I think most of the problems are with the main essay written by Nicole Hannah Jones. Here is Sean Wilentz, the great historian at Princeton, writing in a recent essay about the issues with the 1619 project, beyond just the factual mistakes about the American Revolution being fought to preserve slavery. I mean, that was the main factual problem with 1619. Wilentz goes on to say, instead of trying to instruct the public about the significance of the year 1619, and hence the foundational importance of slavery and racism to American history, the project promoted a narrow, highly ideological view of the American past, according to which white supremacy has been the nation's core principle and chief mission ever since its founding. So I understand your point about competing narratives. It's not the right way to look at this. But on the one side, we do have some folks saying our founding has been a fraud, our principles were betrayed from day one. And on the other side saying our glorious past, Valley Forge and D-Day and George Washington never chopped down a cherry tree. So
neither of these, I mean, this again, Sean's a very good historian.
I love Sean. He knows that.
I disagree with him. He disagrees with me. I disagree with him. We can sit here and talk about his first book and discuss its treatment of race, class. It's a brilliant book. It won all, it deserves all the Chance Democratic. But as, quite frankly, as someone whose focus has been in African-American history, there are disagreements I would have with it, and he and I would sit across the table in a very civil fashion and have this argument. And it's the same way with materials in the 1619 project. I can disagree with some of them. I can agree with some of them. I think that there's absolutely no reason why students cannot get into a really interesting discussion of what founding means.
Yes.
What do we mean when we say founding? Does founding mean the moment that a nation is created? That makes sense to me. But then there's other notion of does founding mean the creation of the foundation upon which the nation grows? In other words, using the word foundation. Those are very different ways of seeing it. And students aren't stupid. They can understand the importance of arguing about this, that in 1619, we can locate in some ways the beginnings of the institution of slavery in the United States. And we can argue that slavery was the foundation of the economy in the early years of the United States.
Yes, in a large part of the country, absolutely.
And that slavery was also by the early 18th century, in essence, baked in to the culture and social relations of much of the country. And that gets you into an argument of what do we think about founding? Yeah. It gives you a good example. Historians actually were arguing for a while over the difference between a society with slaves and a slave society. The 1619 Project is arguing that we were a slave society from the beginning, which I think is hard to argue with. People who are writing these laws that are saying this is a deviation from the founding principles and from the general arc of American history are saying, no, we were a society with slaves. And we can excise that and then go on and march on fine. That's very different from saying we were a slave society, if you think about a medical analogy of what you can excise from their body.
Yeah, so Sean Wilentz was just one of many fine historians who objected to the premise of the 1619 Project, not because they deny the importance of slavery in American history. There were 4 million enslaved people in the United States by 1860, and the Civil War was fought over it. But what I think the point is, just as the 1776 Project lacks nuance, 1619 shoehorns the American Revolution into a narrative that from day one, American history has been an unbroken line of white supremacy to today, where, and also another point, falling along that narrative was Abraham Lincoln was a racist who,
and again,
Thomas Jefferson's statue today was actually taken down in New York City, in the city council chambers. I'll throw that in.
You said has been an unbroken line.
Yeah.
I think it would be hard to argue has included an unbroken line. Those are two different things. It's a subtle difference.
There's more to our history than race.
There's more to our history than race, but You cannot understand our history without understanding that unbroken line. Look, one of the major critics of the 1619 Project, going back to not just Sean, is James Oakes at City University of New York.
Another great historian.
Another great historian. You know what the name of his first book is? The title of his first book?
First book?
His first book.
I don't.
His first book is called The Ruling Race.
Really.
Okay. So it's not as if he doesn't think that this has not been some kind of continuous thread in American history. And this difference between saying that white supremacy has been the essence of American history, as opposed to white supremacy has been omnipresent, has been continuous, and has continued to influence our institutions and our culture. These are two different kinds of things. The Lincoln was a racist. And again, this goes back to what historians do is we argue with each other.
In a civil manner.
In a civil manner. The most important book in some ways, or the most highly visible book that argues that Lincoln was a racist, was a biography of Lincoln called Abraham Lincoln Racist. I don't agree with it. The author was my friend, Lerone Bennett. Lerone and I were good friends in Chicago. We got along very well. We argued with each other rather vigorously, but we were friends and we respected each other as scholars. And this is my point, is that these are different ways of seeing history, and teachers and students benefit from these conversations.
In our culture wars, people can cherry pick facts without nuance. And when you say, well, Abraham Lincoln was a racist, his statues need to come down, you overlook the fact that before he died, he came around to supporting Black suffrage and Black civil rights. And had he not been assassinated, maybe Reconstruction might have went better. And
it's important to know, and again, this goes back to things are not simple, they're complicated, and that it's important to stand for principles with different political valences. The American Historical Association issued a very strong criticism of the San Francisco School Board when it was about to change the name of 44 schools, including Abraham Lincoln High School. And we said, no, you don't have a process where you consulted historians. This was not a serious inquiry into the histories of the people who these schools were named after. No, you shouldn't do this.
And I mentioned before in one of my maze-like sentences that in New York City today, Thomas Jefferson statues coming down from the city council chambers. So let's move on to the issue. Go ahead.
Before we start worrying about Thomas Jefferson, I am a great admirer of a lot of Jefferson's ideas. And so are many Americans on all places in the political spectrum. They're taking a statue of Jefferson down. We can argue about whether or not it should be taken down or not. There's a lot of statues of Thomas Jefferson.
Yes, that's right. I just went to Monticello.
We are not erasing Thomas Jefferson from our history.
No, well, there is an issue. Who gets to decide who is honored and where?
That's right.
That's our next topic, because when you appeared on History as It Happens podcast fairly recently, it was actually in July, around the 4th anniversary of the Unite the Right rally. The Confederate statues did come down. Actually, it was in August. I take that back. The Confederate statues came down in Charlottesville, Generals Lee and Jackson. And our discussion was really about why certain narratives gain ascendancy and why we today believe certain narratives or believe a certain version of history instead of, say, a different or a more complete or a revised version. And I think the issue of the Confederate statues is arguably the best one, because, as a Yankee myself, I moved down to Washington. I'm a Mets fan, but I am from the North. I'm a Yankee, I guess. Moved down to Washington, D.C. about a decade ago, and I noticed that right over the river in Alexandria, there were still streets and roads named after Confederates, and I never really thought about it much, why that would be the case. And in Charlottesville, the statues were not put up right after the Civil War to honor battlefield heroes. They were erected in 1924 as symbols of white power. The Ku Klux Klan held a parade to celebrate the statues. And we got around to discussing the Dunning School, right? So follow my premise, and then I'll let you take it away to explain the Dunning School. I alluded to it before. As children, as young adults, we're greeted by a certain set of values, beliefs, narratives. I call it in the lining of the crib. And then when we're introduced to new ideas, it can be quite, jarring to the senses. The Dunning School interpretation of the Confederacy and Reconstruction just didn't come from some crazy guy in left field. It was a prestigious Ivy League university, and that narrative dominated, that version of history dominated scholarship for about a century, right? So what was the Dunning School, and why is it important? That was a long question.
Fine, and that's fine.
Why is that important for this discussion
So
today?
Dunning was a historian at Columbia University with, he had a lot of PhD students. He had a lot of influence on the ways in which historians wrote about Reconstruction. And basically their argument in a nutshell was that Reconstruction was a failure. It was corrupt, and that the heroes of the period were really what were called the redeemers, the people, the white Southerners who basically drove the black and white Republicans out of the state houses and, quote, redeemed the governments of their states from this corruption. It just wasn't true. It was the way historians saw things for a century. And by the 1960s, historians were again asking different questions, in some cases looking at evidence that had not been looked at before. The Dunning School was the equivalent in some ways, or the follow-up to what one might call the Ulrich Phillips School of Slavery. Phillips, also who taught at a school in the North, an Ivy League school, a white Southerner, argued that slavery was a school. That was the metaphor that he used, and that the children were let out too early. In other words, that emancipation was premature, that enslaved African Americans were not ready for freedom. Dunning then follows that up with an argument that these people who were not ready for freedom were easily manipulated by white Northerners, by Yankees, and other African Americans who instituted these terribly corrupt governments that did great harm. But again, it was seen as freed people as, in essence, childlike. If you look at
paternalistic view of
worse than paternalist in many ways. And this was embodied very powerfully in a film called Birth of a Nation in 1915, which had tremendous influence. One of the things that's important to know, which again, we hadn't really been teaching until, say, 30 years ago, is that African Americans across the North especially fought against the showing of Birth of a Nation. In Chicago, actually, it was banned.
And some people objected to the statues going up in the 1920s in Charlottesville.
And African Americans objected to the statues. The importance of the statues is that a statue basically says to our children and to visitors, these are the values that we honor. And what I've argued in the case of the statuary in the Senate, in the Capitol, is the values that we honor, the people that we honor change. Our population changes, our ideas change, our values change. That's just history. That's what happens.
Consciousness,
everything changes. So why not say every generation, every 25 years, let's step back and look at these statues and say, is that still who we want to honor?
Yeah. And I think the important point here, another important point here, if I may, is just as some people today might object to the teaching of slavery or just how much it might be emphasized in a high school classroom. 100 years ago, you couldn't probably walk into a single high school classroom in the United States and learn that the cause of secession was slavery and that the Civil War was fought over slavery, i.e. the Dunning School. James McPherson, the great historian, has written that about how the Confederates or the Neo-Confederates, the lost cause, well, Neo-Confederate's a modern term. Let me take that back. McPherson has written about how the lost cause mythologizers, the survivors of the Confederacy, understood how important the education system was. They always made sure children were present at these monument unveilings. He wrote, they did that so the rising generation with no personal memories of the war would understand the heroism of their fathers. The United Daughters of the Confederacy had children auxiliaries. The daughters and other Confederate veterans groups had historical committees in the 1890s, and they published textbooks that were basically the textbooks used in schools in the South and elsewhere for, as we said, about a century until the 1950s, 1960s.
Well,
Even
well later than that.
After that,
It's
okay.
in the 50s and 60s that historians,
Okay.
professional historians,
Right.
start to say this stuff isn't true.
That's when the scholarship begins, and it takes
And the
time
textbooks
trickle.
take a bit of time. That's
Yeah,
right.
okay. So to the next subject, the cause of this is, or the result of this is, here's a Washington Post poll, 2019, recent. 52% of Americans know slavery was the main cause of the Civil War, but 41% blame another reason, to our earlier point about what are kids actually being taught, 16, 19 aside.
But again, let me emphasize here, this, in some ways, this is complicated. In some ways, it's not. The 40, was it 41%?
Yeah, 41% said another
reason. Dig into that poll. My guess is that what you're going to find is the other reason is states' rights.
Yeah.
And so if I'm a teacher, I'm going to say to the students, okay, what do we do with this, with these data? So we got 52% saying slavery, we have 41% saying something else, and X percent of those are saying it's states' rights. I'm going to ask the students, well, states' rights to do what?
Yeah.
Is states' rights really a principle by which people take up guns and die and kill other people? No.
Tariffs. No,
State rights.
over tariffs.
States' rights for what?
Yes, right. And that was a means to an end, because
Yes.
when it came to the Fugitive Slave Act, northern states, people in northern states refusing to hand back Black people so they could be enslaved, and again, the slaveholders didn't respect their state rights. Another poll here about the Holocaust, along the same lines, the reason why I introduced the polls about slavery, show that, again, knowledge is superficial. Most adults know what the Holocaust was. This is Pew Research. Know what the Holocaust was and approximately when it happened, but fewer than half can correctly answer multiple choice questions about the number of Jews who were murdered or the way Adolf Hitler came to power. So, and these are just multiple choice questions, but I think the point is, based on these polls, based on what we've been discussing, we need to do a better job educating, I think, everyone about history, not just students. I'll put myself in that list as well.
And it's hard.
Yeah.
Look,
and then in this climate, it's difficult to.
It is. And let's stick with, for a
Yeah.
second, the Holocaust
Yeah.
in American history. Most Americans are not aware of what is basically communicated very straightforwardly in a current exhibit at the U.S. Holocaust Museum, which is that most Americans in the 1930s thought that Americans knew what the Nazis were doing. That's well documented in this exhibition. Most Americans thought it was horrible, and that Jews were suffering, and that what was going on was unconscionable. And they also were opposed. The polls showed they were opposed to letting Jews into this country. So that's a stain on American history, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's an uncomfortable aspect of our history. And this is not a question of one side or the other. These polls are facts. The materials that are on exhibit at the Holocaust Museum are presented in a very straightforward way. These things should make us uncomfortable. And that's part of what's going on. You're a Mets fan.
I
right?
did admit
Okay.
that
You're a
here
Mets
to the
fan.
public. I hope you
Okay.
still respect me. Sorry.
So the founding manager of the Mets, one of
Casey
my
Stengel,
heroes,
yeah.
one of my heroes, Casey Stengel. Turns out Casey Stengel was a virulent racist.
Oh, I did not know.
I did not know that either. So now I have to step back. This is uncomfortable for me. This is a childhood hero. Then I start reading most of my childhood heroes, the baseball players of the 1960s. Not very admirable.
Ty Cobb.
Well, that's earlier, but
Yes,
Ty Cobb is
yeah.
worse. Yes,
Yes, Ty
that's
Cobb.
right. Ty Cobb,
Well,
not very
point being
admirable.
one of the greatest players of all
Not very
time.
admirable is an understatement for
Yes.
Ty Cobb. So what do you do with that? Do you say, well, these are just aberrations, they're deviances from, well, no, because in the case of Cobb, Cobb worked hard to keep Black people out of Major League Baseball. So you can't say, well, this is just something in the past and we fixed it. Because that became deeply embedded in Major League Baseball, that segregation. People suffered, people lost opportunities. We can't just dismiss it as an aberration. It's uncomfortable. These are my heroes.
Yes. Use the word before, civil, how historians debate things most of the time in a civil manner. Certainly on my podcast, there's no arguing.
No.
But there is a lack of civility in this controversy now roiling our country. Again, as I mentioned before, we've all seen news clips of parents at school board meetings who I don't want to overgeneralize here and say they're all pitchforks and whatever that saying is. But there's a lot of anger out there, and some people are being threatened. It's a sensitive subject. I certainly don't want anyone to believe that I'm painting all parents with a broad brush or that all of their concerns aren't worth considering. But there has been a lack of civility about this. So we'll close on this point. From The Atlantic, a great essay by George Packer. Can civics save America? Of course, we can't agree on what should be in civics education, but there is agreement that, I'm pointing to those polls before, that civics education is failing young people to the extent they get any at all. What's your take on that?
I think our testing data shows that mathematics education is failing young people. I think we know from some of the conversations about mask wearing that there must be something about our science education that's failing Americans.
Careful.
We have a different kind of crisis here. What's failing, and it's true, I mean, lack of civic knowledge is a problem. There's no question about that.
It's an attack on expertise.
It's an attack on expertise. That's right. And that's very different. Civic education is about democracy, actually.
Yeah.
And we also have our attacks on democracy right now that are a problem. But the attack on expertise is a problem in terms of when we think about whether it's science, whether it's history, and there's an attack on inquiry. And that's where the civics problem comes in. Do you look at our founding documents as Bibles? Or do you look at our founding documents in a historical context and say, these were created by people? Who were these people? What values did they have? That's not saying that these people were awful people. It's saying who were they and what values did they have? And
it's complicated.
It's complicated. And how did that affect the documents that they wrote?
It makes it more interesting when it's complicated.
And kids are more interested then in it. Teenagers don't want pablum fed to them. And quite frankly, we know it doesn't work. The historical precedent for what you've been describing here is McCarthyism in the 1950s. We've seen this before. In fact, recently, one of the publications, or a few of the places where people are in favor of this legislation, they've said, if your kid's teacher is using any of the following 10 or 20 phrases, then they're teaching CRT. That's almost word for word. If your kids' teachers are using the following words, they must be a communist. This was all over the United States in the 50s and 60s. I'm 69 years old. That means that I'm roughly the same age as a lot of the people who were in school, some are a little older than me. There's not a lot of communists out there. If the teachers were indoctrinating the students, they failed miserably.
Some of my leftist history and political science professors in college used to joke around with me. If we're trying to undermine and subvert American society, we're doing a pretty bad job. Well, James Grossman of the American Historical Association, we thank you for this great conversation. Hope we got people thinking today.
Well, I hope so too, because that is what historians do, is we try to get people thinking.
And
That's our goal.
And you will get people thinking by listening to History as It Happens podcast. You were on an episode recently. People can look that one up. Charlottesville says goodbye to the Confederacy. From the Washington Times, I want to thank everyone who's been watching this conversation. I'm Martin Di Caro, and have a great day.